Hello and welcome to the Broadcast Newswrap, your shorthand guide to the week's biggest news in TV, brought to you by the Broadcast editorial team. This week we're taking a trip out of London and into the BBC's Nations and Regions master plan. Who wins? Who loses? Who needs to think about buying a new house in a new city? Plus, we'll hear from the team behind the shocking BBC One doc-series, Football's Darkest Secret, and we'll reveal our latest TV habits in What We've Been Watching. I'm Jesse Whittock, and this is the Broadcast Newswrap. So, joining me today is broadcast senior reporter Max Goldbart. We're going to dissect what has been described as the BBC's biggest reform of programme services and operations since the 1990s. Tim Davies says it's bigger than the relocation, or at least partial relocation, to Salford in the 2000s. Max, how are you?
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Jesse, and glad to be featuring on the news wrap for another week. It's been a busy old day.
Yeah, it seems so. There's a lot to unpack here. This is quite a structural change for the BBC, and you have been sort of digging into and behind the headlines. So what's actually been said today, and what do people need to know about the announcement?
Yeah, so there's plenty in here. It's funny. We sort of received a couple of days ago. The media reporters received like a quite guarded invitation to a briefing, and nobody really knew what it was about. It was quite similar to the sort of invitations that we get before the BBC annual reports, and it clearly made out that it was going to be quite a big deal. Yesterday, some reports started coming out that there was going to be a big relocation to Leeds or to Newcastle, but albeit without very much detail. And one of the things that Tim Davie, who, by the way, is marking 6 months in the job, but one of the main things that he's talked about quite frequently is the nations and regions. And he did a little coded all-staff speech a couple of weeks ago where he talked about moving. And Tony Hall, actually, about a year ago, did a speech whereby he said 2/3 of the BBC could be out of London by 2027. So this is the natural progression from that, really. So what have we got? There's quite a few things in today's announcement. Currently, the BBC has to make 50% of its shows outside of London. That is going to increase to 60. So a 10% increase is quite big. That's millions of pounds. That's lots of hours. That's quite a really decent increase. In our world, in the kind of TV commissioning production company world, new commissioning roles are going to be created in the northeast of England, the northwest, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And 4 of these new roles are going to support new writer development, which I thought was interesting. So there's going to be a head of new writing is the post. That's going to be announced quite soon. With 4 more commissioning roles. So commissioners are springing up in a few places. A lot of this is about portrayal, and we'll go on to talk about this at length in a little bit. So over the next 3 years, at least 100 scripted titles will reflect the lives of the UK's nations and regions communities, and 20 of those will specifically be Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, so the UK nations.
So do you think, Max, that the BBC has seen some of the schedules on other channels and thought, you know what, I want me some more Yorkshire programming?
I think there's plenty of this knocking around at the moment, and the specifically this thing about 100 scripted titles. I think the BBC was very careful at stating that they will reflect the lives of the UK's nations and regions communities, right, rather than stating that they will specifically be produced within the nations and regions. So unfortunately, that appears to pave the way for shows that can be made in London but about the nations and regions, which is obviously like a good thing in one sense. It's a good thing for portrayal, but it doesn't help with the longer term issues around skills bases and talent bases outside of London, which I think we'll touch on. 2 new high volume scripted series to be commissioned outside of London. One will be from the north of England and the other from the nations, and that's some big work. That's transformative, I think, for a scripted indie. It'll be like the equivalent of a Casualty or a Doctors. They've specified that at least 30 episodes per year. So that's big business. I'm not quite sure on timescales there, but That's a big deal for a couple of production companies at least. And then changes in news. So as we speak, actually, we're recording at around 3:30 on the 18th of March. More and more information is coming out about some cuts to the news division, which may have been sort of secretly slid out a little bit. They didn't really come up in the briefing that we had earlier. So 50% of the BBC News divisions are going to be moved. These are new, what's called theme-led divisions. So as has been covered already, as was announced about a year ago, the BBC News is moving to what's called a theme-led structure. So it'll have different divisions focused on, say, business or the environment or politics. And some of these are moving to Leeds, some of them are moving to Birmingham, some of them are moving to Salford. This equates to around 200 jobs with another 100 digital posts created. And some people are going to lose their jobs as well.
It'll go one of two ways, won't it? There'll be lots of opportunities for local staff, but there's also, like you say, going to be a fair number of people who are leaving the BBC as a result of these changes.
There are not that many people relocating at the moment, like especially considering how transformative these are being described. There are these 200 news roles that are relocating, but there isn't a figure yet on the roles that are relocating from the TV commissioning teams or the TV in-house production teams. And a lot of the talk, that there are lots of comparisons being made to the move to Salford, which was sort of towards not the end of last decade, but the prior decade, Media City UK. But 2,000 people moved to Salford, of which 2/3 actually ended up not deciding against moving, and local people were hired instead. So this is quite different. Like I said, there isn't really a figure on it yet. It will probably only amount to, again, a couple of hundred in TV commissioning and the wider TV teams, I believe. So there is a little bit of a difference there. Again, it sort of goes back to portrayal almost.
It's very much the case, we find, speaking to producers and following social media, that one of the big gripes within the nations and regions is this perception that London-based producers will sort of rock up, will produce a piece of television, whether that's just a morning VT for a news show or whether that's a bigger series, partially relocate over. That's been a big frustration for many years, and I think it still is a question and a debate that is ongoing.
I've been thinking a lot about comparisons to Salford and the conversation. There is no doubt that back then, when it almost felt like the nations and regions had been abandoned for a good decade, but back then the idea of lift and shift was much more necessary. So moving a specific production just for a short period of time to a different city or a different nation. But the conversation has come on a long way since then, and nations and regions programming has vastly improved. The landscape for it has vastly improved. Channel 4 is obviously off the back of having relocated quite a few commissioners, and Channel 4 actually, I think, has been much more specific in terms of moving specific genres or specific people than what this proposal so far outlines. But what this is all about in our world, I think, in our TV broadcasting world and its relation to production companies, this is all about big returners, really. This is all about the idea that commissioners will be in different parts of the country in this, what they're describing as a pan-UK commissioning model. And we can have a bigger organic turnover of high volume returning series. Kat Lewis, who oversees the indie trade body, the indie club, who lobbies for the nations and regions, and she's really happy with this because it seems to lend itself really well to these returners and shifts the conversation on.
And as a final point on this nations and regions plan that Tim Davies rolled out, he's talked a lot about representation today and about what this means for the BBC, sort of the portrayal of what the BBC is trying to represent. But what is he getting at here?
So Tim Davie, coming in last September when the period of goodwill that had been afforded to the BBC around the coronavirus was kind of waning a little bit. It couldn't go on forever. And he has been very keen to make representing the UK in its entirety one of the absolute key planks to his approach. I would say that and impartiality and his ideas around fewer, bigger, better, and his ideas about boosting commercial are kind of his real like main points that he just continues to hit. And this really speaks to that. So I've kind of touched on it a little bit so far today, but as I said, talks even more about portrayal than he does necessarily about like specifically moving people to a specific place. It's noticeable that a lot of the big pushes are in more sort of Brexit heartland areas, such as the Northeast. There's quite a lot of talk of the Northeast and the Northwest. And something I found really interesting is within the proposal, within this 13-page proposal, there are some very specific places singled out. It gets very granular. So if you'll just bear with me a second, there's one bullet point that says our programming across all genres will portray stories from all corners of the UK, including current commissions set in Birmingham, Belfast, Bolton, Bristol, Cardiff, Cumbria, Cornwall, Coventry, Edinburgh, Faslane, Gateshead, Halifax, Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester. And then we've got Middlesbrough, Mansfield, Newcastle upon Tyne, Nottingham, Norwich, Port Talbot, and County Down. He ends with County Down. So I enjoy the granularity of those places. And to me, it again speaks to the idea that he knows the BBC needs to do better at speaking beyond metropolitan cities. And there is embedded in all of this is that idea. And it seems to have really driven these proposals.
There's also a very strange alphabetization of that list there. Beginning with B and running through to I think it was P, and then jumping back to
County Down, yeah.
To County Down, a very strange addition at the end there. I'd also be annoyed if I was from Ayr or Aberdeen or anywhere towards the end of the alphabet. It sounds like they're not included in these proposals. And
the more granular they go, the more people you're going to upset. So I would say be really careful. But it is really interesting. Look, John Whittingdale, the culture minister, has spoken about the BBC needing to embrace the government's levelling up agenda. And that's obviously about speaking to so many of these places. And there's a lot of politics involved with that. And while the BBC's involvement with that is less overtly political, clearly that is something that Tim Davie is really keen to keep pushing on, and it seems to be going okay so far. So that'll be fascinating to look out for.
And just as a final point here, Max, how sort of seismic and important is the announcement today?
That for me remains to be seen. I don't quite know if it's going to be as transformative as they're making out, and I think there are still some I's to dot and some T's to cross. Like I said, I sound like a broken record, but it feels more about representation and portrayal for me than it does about like an uproot of the way that the BBC works. And I think in a few years' time, most of the big commissioning departments are still majoritarily going to be based here in the capital. While the content may have changed to some extent, I'm not sure how much that will point back to what happened today. I would be a little bit skeptical. Whereas Salford, it was much clearer what was going on. There were 2,000 people were moving to a specific place far away from London. Whereas this, I think there's quite a lot more subtle stuff going on. I'm not for a second saying that it's not a big deal, but I think quite a lot remains to be seen.
You may well have seen the headlines on bbc.co.uk already, but next week BBC One will strip the shocking 3-part documentary series, Football's Darkest Secret. The series exposes serious failings within the English football establishment that allowed the despicable sexual abuse of young boys to go unchecked for many years. Max spoke to the series producer Hugh Davies and director Daniel Gordon about pulling the series together and what the series exposes and may mean going forwards.
I think, like everyone, I was really shocked when the allegations first came out, and we're going back to November 2016, which obviously a year ago seems a lifetime ago, doesn't it? But this really doesn't seem like that long ago. And I'd just done the Hillsborough film for BBC, and I was looking at what could possibly be, you know, a big story to a big subject matter to tackle, and it felt like the right kind of story, but very quickly I sort of backed away from it because I just felt there was so much happening and the story was evolving so much so quickly that it just didn't feel like the right time to be tackling this story. And about 6 months later, I'd already sort of decided that I felt it was at least 5 years away from being told properly. And so we're talking sort of the summer of 2017. Hugh approached me and had carried on researching and looking into and connecting with some of the survivors and with police forces. And although I was reticent to sort of jump back into it, he was very persuasive. And we met up in Sheffield. We had a discussion. I very quickly thought we do need to make this film, that this is a story that really needs to be told.
And 3 years in the making it feels like a great deal of time. Is that quite unusual for a documentary of this scope?
No, I'd say it's just about right. I think we're getting on for almost 4 years in the making. Most of my projects are between 2 and 5 years to make, and you need that time and space to figure out what the story is. This was always going to be a 3-part series, and it still ended up being slightly longer than the 3 initial hours that we envisaged. But we always felt it was a big story, and they need time. They need the time and space to be able to tell that fully. We also had a number of high-profile criminal cases that we were going to follow that we just didn't know what was going to happen. So it wasn't like a historical story that we could just tell what had happened. There was an awful lot of material and storyline happening in the present.
And Hugh, what was your involvement kind of throughout this process?
So I'm the producer on the series. You know, as Dan said, I kind of reached out to him, having developed some access to a few of the guys and some of the police forces that were beginning to kind of engage in investigations. And yeah, I mean, we kind of looked at it together and thought it kind of really needed telling. And then, you know, over the past few years, as Dan said, we've been following a number of criminal trials, you know, one up in Liverpool, one down in Winchester, and another in Newcastle. So, you know, I spent a lot of time, you know, following those trials in person and, you know, getting to know the various people involved in the story and sort of cultivating those relationships, I suppose.
One of the parts of the first episode that really struck me is the Victoria Derbyshire interview, which I do remember from the time. And I also remember actually that interview was used as a main kind of arguing block for the Victoria Derbyshire show not being taken off air. I remember that quite well, and it was brilliant and won awards, and I thought she did really well. And I was thinking about having all of these men who'd been so brave, getting them to open up once again for your documentary. So how did you go about that, really? What was your relationship like with these guys?
Well, I mean, from my point of view, Hugh had made inroads in with a number of the guys initially, and it was then a case really of meeting up with them, telling them what we saw as a documentary, really wanting to find out more, because some of them had disclosed certain elements to Victoria Derbyshire, but had sort of kept some back. And it was really having that relationship with the survivors and making sure they understand that we viewed this as it was always going to be a survivor-led film. In order for them to trust us, they viewed, you know, previous documentaries of mine to see how I approach things and how I try and deal, you know, as sensitively as I can with people who have got quite horrific stories to tell. And I guess once we got that trust, it was then about spending as much time as possible with them, you know, before we even filmed anything. Legally, we were quite restricted. If anyone was involved in a current case, we couldn't even speak to them other than to tell them what we were doing, because then that would involve all sorts of legal issues for us. So we steered clear of a lot of people away from, you know, who were involved in current processes. And then once certain trials concluded, then we were able to sit down with them, you know, and do the interview. And by then they were ready to tell their story, and they knew that this was, you know, their opportunity to tell their story.
I would just add to that as well. I think, you know, one of the things that we were, you know, when we first set out, that we were kind of trying to do was both tell a retrospective story as well as a kind of unfolding story. You know, so whilst a number of the guys had spoken out previously about, you know, what had happened to them in the past, kind of right from the beginning, I think our sort of collective aim was to try to tell a story of, you know, these men and their attempts to get justice, you know, all these decades later, while simultaneously kind of looking back at what had happened to them in the past. So, it felt like, that was kind of the goal. And I guess that was, we conveyed that to the guys, that there was a new element to what we were trying to do here, which was to kind of see, what this feels like as a survivor to come forward. And I think we felt like we had quite a unique opportunity to try to give an insight into, not just what it's like to go through the criminal justice process as a survivor of historical sexual abuse, but also what it's like for the families, and relatives of survivors, that kind of ripple effect that child abuse has on loved ones and on people through their lives.
One of the things I really liked was the way you jumped between time. So I really enjoyed those visuals of moving quite seamlessly between 2016, 2017 and the sort of 60s, 70s onwards. But it sounds like a really challenging concept, the idea of being able to be retrospective and also following events as they go. So was that a real challenge for you guys, or is that something you've done previously?
I think to the extent that we did it, that's something new for me. I've done films where we have gone back and forth, but not quite as often. And what the challenge was to try and weave these sort of two elements of the here and now and the past life. And from the here and now, we're talking from that November 2016 onward. And sometimes we were going back to the 70s, sometimes it was the 90s. You want to try and keep the audience on that road and not get them confused and sort of know you're going back in time and without it being tricksy. I think that was a big challenge for us. And we just felt that, it was going to take time. There was never going to be a narrator in the film. So that was a huge challenge in terms of just trying to make this work. Most of the films I make have got no narrator in it. So that just takes longer to do. And we were prepared for that.
Just back to the contributors again, I was just wondering if you had much pushback. I mean, I imagine that they were so brave in coming forward in the first instance, led by Andy Woodward in The Guardian with Daniel Taylor in 2016. Subsequently, many more came forward. And when it came to you guys making the doc, was there any pushback from people saying, we've done this, we've made this huge step, and we don't want to revisit it once again for the second time in whatever 3 or 4 years?
I don't recall. I might be wrong. I don't recall any pushback as such. What we were very careful to do was not to ask anyone to engage with us if we didn't think that they were going to be interviewed and be on the film. And that was a commitment that we made for everyone. Once we interviewed someone on camera, they were going to end up in the series. And also when we were doing those initial discussions with people, we were really at pains to underline that this wasn't a casting session. We just wanted to speak to them and we'd be trying to figure out what we were going to do. And because it was clearly going to be quite a complex series, we just didn't want to go down the road where, that seems like a good idea, but actually when you get into the edit, it's really not a good idea. Now you've interviewed someone and you're not going to use them. So it was quite a long process, I think, of getting ready before we did the actual interviewing. Also, because we were able to attend these criminal trials, we were getting an awful lot of material and understanding and knowledge of people's backstories and their evidence. So we could interview them afterwards with that knowledge, that we wouldn't have necessarily got otherwise. And so we were able to just work out, who was similar and who was very different and who had a slightly different story to tell in order to work out what would make sort of the best overall representation of again, this very complicated story.
And I'd just add, I think also, part of that process was getting to understand which survivors were comfortable with talking about their stories publicly. I think we were very fortunate, as you mentioned, that some people had already done some brilliant work on this subject matter, like Daniel Taylor, Victoria Derbyshire, Deborah Davis. So, we were able to kind of draw on the work that they'd done and get a sense for which survivors would be most comfortable telling their story.
From the BBC point of view, it's quite rare for the BBC to show a documentary one day after the other in this stripped kind of format. I think the last time was about 3 years ago with the Stephen Lawrence documentary, which I think was extremely impactful. Do you think that will? Are you pleased with the way that the BBC are approaching that, and do you think that will change the way in which people watch the documentary or consume the documentary?
I mean, for me personally, I'm delighted that the BBC have taken that decision. They'd been planning to from very early on. I think once we started to get an understanding of what we were getting on camera, I think they wanted to have the highest impact, and it's not about ratings really. It's about, for them, it really is about having these guys' voices heard. That's something that they've always said, from the beginning when we started talking to them about it, that it was clear that these guys needed to have their voices heard. And so, yeah, I mean, it's for us as a production, it's brilliant to have something like this go out three nights on the trot. We're very grateful for it, but it is a subject matter that needs talking about, and I think having that high impact gives it the best possible chance to for people to see it and to understand it. And I think at the time, I do recall some people going, at the time, I'm going back to 2016, November 2016, there was this sort of almost a gasp and a drop your mouth kind of moment. But then you start thinking, oh, why didn't these guys say something at the time, or what prevented them? And I think this series really does give you a really full, deep understanding of how this behaviour, how people get away with it, and what happens to these guys. And I think, again, just telling their stories is hugely important. So to have that impact of 3 nights on a trot is really, really, we're grateful for it, and I think the survivors are too.
And you said that ratings isn't necessarily at the forefront of your mind. Are there other more long-term impacts that you're hoping this documentary will have?
I just think I just want the subject matter to be heard. It's really painful to view. It's really brutal at times, and it's had an impact on the two of us. We
talk and write about duty of care quite a lot here at Broadcast, in all different TV genres. And how about for you guys? Like, how is it almost keeping your mental health in check when you're spending such a long period of time speaking to these people, talking about these topics?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, as you say, duty of care is absolutely vital, and has been a huge consideration on a project like this. We've had support throughout the project from the NSPCC, both for the whole of the production staff and also for all of the contributors. We've had additional psychological support recently has been made available by the BBC. We've taken it very, very seriously. We've had, both within the production and also for the contributors. So, yeah, I'd say we've been very mindful of having psychological support in place for ourselves throughout the production and also for the contributors. But as you say, and as Dan sort of alluded to, yeah, it's very challenging. And I think, the last few years with what's been happening in the world, has also meant that this has been a challenging period in everyone's lives. So, navigating that alongside, the difficulties of engaging in a project like this, for survivors has been challenging. But I don't think, Dan, I mean, I think we've had kind of amazing support structure in place, and I'm so grateful to the NSPCC for how they've helped us throughout the production.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. I think when we got to the end of the process filmically with Hillsborough, I hadn't quite appreciated the toll that took on all of us, and I was quite mindful of that when we started this project. But again, I think I seriously underestimated how much was going to be involved for us as a production. I think it's one of the best decisions we made was engaging with the NSPCC. They have been brilliant for all of us, certainly myself and Hugh included. They've been there for us, and we've had, again, it's stressful enough making any production or any series, but then you sort of throw in, the contributors' lives and their stories and their ups and downs. So yeah, we've been mindful of duty of care, but one of the things that you tend to do is take care of everyone else and not take care of yourself. So it's been quite good. We've got, myself and Hugh have got an excellent relationship, and we're kind of able to look out for each other, but there are times when we're both quite low and someone else will pick us up, and it has been a challenge to try and have that duty of care across absolutely everybody. But again, to underline that both the NSPCC and more recently the BBC have understood very quickly that we all need a little bit of help as we approach the broadcast, and certain I guess the sort of sensitivity becomes higher as you approach broadcast.
We're predominantly a TV podcast, and we love to ask our guests what they've been watching. But I thought specifically I might, in reference to this show, ask you guys maybe about a recent documentary that either inspired football's darkest secret or that you learned some techniques from.
I guess we've watched, we've been conscious of other films in this space. Athlete A is a big Netflix film about, the gymnastics coach abuse scandal there. But I guess, I don't know, in terms of sort of influences, I'm not sure, Dan. I might look to you on that.
I purposely haven't gone to all the abuse documentaries at all for reference. And it's funny because this past year, for all the, supposedly the time that we've had at home, and normally I'm never at home, full stop, I barely watched any TV. And I guess I've actually found, funnily enough, the last few months is Schitt's Creek has saved me. Just in terms of my mental well-being, just to sit down at the end of the night, in theory 20 minutes, but ends up being an hour or an hour and 20, depending how many I actually sit down and view. But that has been a genuine saviour.
Thank you so much. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure, Hugh and Daniel, listening to a little bit more about the making of this documentary. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, mate. Cheers.
Cheers.
The show is also an example of the BBC providing public service broadcasting at its journalistic best. Max, you've seen it, and it's what you've been watching this week.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, my what we've been watching this week is going to be football's darkest secret, which I was given the pleasure of watching on preview prior to my interview with Hugh and Daniel, and I can highly recommend it. I've watched the first 2 episodes. It's very long. That's what I'll say. I think, considering it's obviously about one quite specific subject and a story that has been told quite a bit in national newspapers over the last few years, depending on how much one might have followed it, I would have thought it might have been like a really heavy hitting single, but it's actually 3 parts, of which the second one is an hour and 20 minutes. So I've watched the first 2, of which 2 hours and 20 minutes of my time has been given to it. And for something that is really quite depressing and really quite grave, you would think that might be a little bit of overkill, but I can absolutely confirm that it's not. It's a really beautifully shot documentary. It has one of the most enjoyable kind of time-lapse sequences that I think I've seen in a doc. So it moves really seamlessly between back then, which is the 70s and 80s, and then 2016 onwards, which is when these allegations, which had actually previously come out a couple of times, but were returned to the fore with an interview an ex-footballer Andy Woodward did with the Guardian's Daniel Taylor. It's really, really sad. The testimony of the men is quite brutal. They've got there are kind of 10 or so survivors of this harrowing experience who contribute to the documentary, and you learn about their stories and you hear from their parents, and it's something that you sort of have to adjust to early on and then realize that you're going to listen to for quite a while. But it doesn't get boring. The harrowing nature of it isn't too much of a problem. I found that I could stay with it. And I was also learning a lot at the same time about what actually took place. And it will just really rile you up as well. Like, you cannot believe it's again, one of those kind of cultural things that's entrenched in a different time. You simply cannot believe this stuff was allowed to take place. You simply cannot believe these people were allowed to go unchecked for so many years. And it really gets you thinking. So it's going to be, like you said, it's going to be stripped next week. It's going to be available as an iPlayer box set from episode 1, which is interesting in itself. And I could recommend to football fans and non-football fans alike. Jesse, how about yourself? What have you been watching this week?
So my time's been split between two very distinct types of television watching. So in the AM, my morning goes woken up by my cats at 6 a.m, fight them off until about 6:30, and then go and feed them. And then I'll jump on to the exercise bike in my living room, and I'll watch a couple of episodes of NBC Superstore, which is available over here on Netflix. Superstore is one of these American sitcoms, ensemble cast, which I think probably would have passed me by had it not been on Netflix. I sort of just flicked it on, not expecting very much, wasn't particularly thrilled by it, but have now got to the point where I'm sort of binging through it quite quickly and have grown to really enjoy the characters, as you might expect. It's set in a superstore, an American superstore called Cloud9. There are some really enjoyable characters. America Ferrera, who was in Ugly Betty, plays one of the leads. And there are several sort of, I'd say if you were American, you'd probably know them actors, but not hardly any other kind of well-known international actors. But it's a fun series, lots of jokes, kind of very in that very US network style of comedy. It's quite broad, but some of it can be a bit like, wow, that I'm surprised that one made it past the standards boards. So that's what I'll do in the morning, and then in the evening, my wife and I are watching another American series, Snowpiercer, which is the drama that TBS. Which is one of the Warner Media channels produces. It's again over here. It's distributed through Netflix, and it's based on the South Korean film of the same name. And it's kind of a strange, like really super high concept. So it's quite a cool idea. Very well put together, I'll say. US cable series. You really feel like the budget is done well, because it's all obviously very small and claustrophobic, and whilst lots of scenes are shot in the same sorts of places and maybe the same empty cars, so you certainly don't see 1001 of them. It's just really well put together, and it doesn't feel particularly schlocky at all. Thank you for joining me today, Max. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See you later. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the Broadcast Newswrap, and be sure to check in to broadcastnow.co.uk for more news and views on the British telly landscape. You can subscribe to the podcast and listen back to all older episodes by going to your preferred podcast platform and downloading. This episode was presented by me, Broadcast Insight Editor Jesse Whittock, and I was joined by Max Goldbart, who doubled as this week's editor.